Hello, my name is Denise Page Hood, and I'm the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. And I'd like to welcome you to our 2020 Power Act presentation. The Power Act, the Pro Bono Work to Empower and Represent Act, enacted in 2018, requires each United States District Court to conduct a public event for the purpose of promoting pro bono legal services for survivors of domestic violence, including dating violence, sexual assaults, stalking, and other forms of domestic violence. We're also required to, if we have Indian lands or a Native American tribe or a Native American organization in our district, to have our public event include them in the presentation for the same purposes, to promote pro bono legal services for women or men or children who are victims of domestic violence. In 2019, we hosted an event at the Wayne County Community College, a panel of people educating people about domestic violence and indicating the need for lawyers to step up to the plate and represent such victims. This year, we are doing it virtually because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has caused our court to be closed to the public since March 24th, 2020. But we needed to go ahead with a Power Act presentation, and that's what we're doing by video today. And so I hope you'll be able to tune in and watch this at your leisure or with a group, followed by a discussion. On our program today, we have Ashley Lowe, the Executive Director of Lakeshore Legal Aid, Stephanie Schul, who will present some statistics so that you can know how pervasive domestic violence is in our communities. We also have with us Judge Melissa Ann Cox from the Wayne County Circuit Court Family Division to talk about Wayne County and the state of Michigan insofar as the policies and procedures that are followed in court relative to domestic violence. We also have the Honorable Patrick Shannon, the Chief Judge for the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan, who will talk about domestic violence on native lands or in tribal instances. And we'll also talk about how the tribal courts handle domestic violence issues. We have Roy Krantz, who's the United States Attorney. At least he's a prosecutor, a Assistant United States Attorney from the Eastern District of Michigan. And he will talk from Bay City about domestic violence, also on the Indian lands. I also want to thank the members of our court family who have assisted in putting this program together. First, Maureen Flavin, who is our Deputy Court Administrator, and she's taken on the task of planning the Power Act programs for the last 2 years, including this one. I'd also like to thank Kelly Clark, who's responsible for the videotaping of this proceeding, and Crystal Flood, who is called on to do just about anything in our court. So we thank all three of you for putting this together. Again, I want to encourage you to be inspired by what you hear and also to take action by volunteering your legal services to help someone who's a victim of domestic violence. I hope you'll enjoy the program, and as I said, it will be informative for you.
Our first speaker is Ashley Lowe. Ashley Lowe is Lakeshore Legal Aid's Chief Executive Officer. After Lakeshore received a grant in 2016 from Legal Services Corporation, Ms. Lowe joined Lakeshore, playing an integral part in its successful 3-year expansion. Ms. Lowe serves as a tireless advocate, extending empathy and attention to the communities Lakeshore serves. She has spoken about trauma-informed practice at the Institute of Continuing Legal Education Family Law Institute.
All right, I'm Ashley Lowe. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Lakeshore Legal Aid, which is a nonprofit law firm that provides free civil legal services to low-income people, seniors, and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault throughout the state via our attorney-staffed hotline. And we also provide direct representation in Southeast Michigan. Just a little bit so you know how I got involved in domestic violence. I've been an attorney for 25 years, and I started doing domestic violence work while I was in law school. I worked in a domestic violence clinic. For the first 5 years of my legal career after law school, I worked in big firms, one in San Francisco and one here in Detroit. And I was able to do some pro bono work that related to PPOs and other work around domestic violence and family law, but really didn't get into it until about 5 years into my career when I left large firms to focus specifically on domestic violence advocacy. I started as a staff attorney at Legal Aid in Pontiac, and then I ran the Women's Survival Center, which also focused family law services just on survivors of domestic violence. I taught after that. I worked at Cooley Law School in Auburn Hills, where I founded and directed the Family Law Assistance Project. That is a partnership between Cooley Law School and Lakeshore Legal Aid that provided free civil services, family law services to low-income people in Oakland County. And after I left Cooley, I worked at Wayne State Law School, where I taught in the free legal aid clinic. Also a partnership with Lakeshore Legal Aid, where we provided services to low-income people in domestic violence matters. Since 2016, I've been the Chief Executive Officer at Lakeshore, but for at least the past 20 years, I have been teaching law students and training lawyers on family law, domestic violence, and the impact of trauma, particularly on survivors and the lawyers who are working with them. So I've been asked about how domestic violence impacts the community that we serve. And I think it's important to talk about what that community is. Most of the clients that we see in legal aid are low income. So we have a little bit of wiggle room from some grants relating to domestic violence, so we can go a little bit higher than our very low income standards. But generally speaking, we provide services to people who are 200% of the federal poverty level or less. So that's about 25,000 for one person, or if you think about a family of 4, it's about 52,000. So very low income people. And we are working mostly in Oakland, Macomb, and Wayne counties. And then we also have some offices in the Thumb. We have one in Port Huron and Caro. So that's who our universe is when I think about the community that we serve. And so the intersection for us about domestic violence and poverty is very important. And we know that that link is very significant. We know that poverty increases the risk of violence. If you look at the numbers, about 25% of women report domestic abuse. If you look at homeless women, about 50% of homeless women report abuse. So being homeless increases the risk of violence. And about 70% of women who receive public welfare support report abuse. So we know that when people are seeking assistance, they're also survivors of abuse. And we also know that abuse creates economic instability. So everything is up in the air. Abusers may pressure or force a victim to quit her job, may say, I want you to stop getting your degree, whether that's your high school degree or college or advanced degrees, but limiting that and pressuring as part of a process of isolation so that so there's less input, less involvement with the community, so stopping those things that could actually expand their ability to function as an economic participant in our community. They may also, the isolation and the control may lead to missed work. Sometimes survivors miss work or classes in their education in order to hide physical abuse or seeking treatment. And emotional abuse can make it really challenging or frankly impossible to maintain employment or education. If the person that you live with is telling you you're worthless, it's hard to get up every day and fight the fight and do a good job at the things that you're doing. So that really limits the income capacity for survivors. Abuse also leads to housing instability. The isolation of abuse may have caused a survivor to break ties with their family and friends, those same people that the survivor might need to go to say, can me and my kids come stay with you while I get on my feet? Those people, the abuser may have cut those people off, has said those people aren't good for you. So now the survivor doesn't have anywhere to go, and really their housing options are limited. We know that a lack of alternative housing often leads women to stay in or return to a violent relationship. On top of that, shelters. Shelters in most times only allow for 30-day stays. So we know that it takes about 6 months for someone to find secure permanent housing once they are unstable. And so that 30 days is just not enough to get a survivor on her feet and to get a place for her kids to stay. So they're often then resorting to either returning to their abuser or some other unstable relationship or situation that's not going to be good for the long term. Abuse also limits transportation. Sometimes batterers will take away a car or say, we only have one car and I'm going to take it to work. And so you're here by yourself, leaving the survivor to deal with public transportation, which in our region is could be non-existent or unsafe or just very cumbersome. So all the impacts of a lack of a vehicle or public transportation, meaning that the victim is reliant on their abuser for getting anywhere they go. Or now we know there's all kinds of tracking that goes on, right? That there's a tracking in your cell phone, tracker on your car. So the survivor may not feel comfortable going around freely, even in their own vehicle, because they know that their abuser is tracking where they go. And those impacts of abuse continue in the long term. That stalled education will have an impact on the survivor's life for many, many years to come. Those limited job prospects will continue, right? They had to quit their job because they had to seek treatment for their physical abuse, or they had to keep missing days, or really weren't in the game when they were there. That limits their job prospects going forward. It's also very common for abusers to damage the credit of a victim. So using their credit to apply for loans or not paying off credit cards in the victim's name, so that they end up leaving a relationship with zero resources in terms of finance. And we can't underestimate the health impacts. When somebody is a victim of abuse, they may not seek treatment for regular healthcare things, regular prevention, because they don't want to go, or they're told not to go by their abuser to go see their medical provider. It's also common that the abuser is the person who is the one who's employed and has the insurance and can restrict that access to the insurance to the victim. And so all that compounds to say that healthcare is put secondary, and regular preventative care doesn't happen. And so their health impacts can be very significant, in addition to the physical violence that could happen, that could be life-changing. So right now, I think it's important to talk about how COVID is impacting domestic violence. I will say that right in the immediate aftermath of the lockdown back in March, we saw very little in terms of applications for personal protection orders and in seeking complaints or filing complaints about domestic violence with the police. And it's not surprising, right, that those survivors were trapped in a home with their abuser, and there's no place that it felt safe to go. Certainly back in March, and even now, many of us wouldn't feel comfortable going to a shelter. And if someone is being isolated, and even if they are, nobody really wants to invite a bunch of people into their home, not knowing the circumstances. So really, survivors didn't have many options in terms of leaving, and they were trapped in their homes with their abusers. I mentioned earlier the technology of cars. Well, even if you're not leaving, right now, we're on Zoom, we're on our phones, we're on whatever technology that we're using. And so that is an easy way for batterers to track everything that somebody is doing. And that whether they're doing anything that is interesting or not, that feeling of being tracked is very oppressive and also very dangerous. On the flip side, there's not a lot of support. So it's difficult for survivors to have in-person contact, for sure, with counselors or other support people who might be able to give resources and provide an out for somebody who's suffering from abuse. Shelters may feel unsafe. And on top of that, everybody's under stress. We all know that this has been the most stressful 6 months of anyone's life. And that only makes things worse in terms of domestic abuse. Certainly doesn't cause domestic abuse, but it makes things worse. And there's increased opportunity for abuse when abusers aren't leaving their homes every day to go to work. That working from home environment, there's never a time that the that the victim has a time in their home alone when the batterer is not there, telling them what to do, controlling, and abusing over and over. And so that piece is just is overwhelmingly oppressive. Also leading with having to do childcare, and now online schools are back. Maybe the survivor lost their job or is working from home, and that creates a lot of anxiety. Certainly people are and have been afraid to go to hospitals if they are physically injured because of abuse, because of concerns about the coronavirus. I think that has reduced a little bit over time because we're seeing that hospitals are able to, have been able to address the needs of people who aren't there for COVID. But I think it is also, it raises a concern. And so for people who have underlying health conditions, that can be a reason that they're not seeking care. Abusers, I've heard a lot of stories of abusers threatening to throw victims out of their house if they report the abuse. So that's a very real fear right now. And when at the beginning of the pandemic, when the jails released a lot of people, some of those people were abusers in domestic violence cases. And so that again, ratcheting up the fear and the risk for survivors. It's important to know that courts are functioning for PPOs, and so people can certainly file for those, and we're seeing more of that. So first 3 months after the pandemic, we didn't see very much at all. Everything was very quiet in terms of the public side of domestic violence. We knew that it was there and it was dangerous, but now we're starting to see that people are coming out and they are seeking assistance. The Michigan Legal Help, which is a website that helps people who are representing themselves in all kinds of civil cases. They have an online application for personal protection orders. And that website really saw a dip in things relating to PPOs, personal protection orders, starting in March. Only 155 people tried to fill out an application for a personal protection order. But those are going up a lot, and they've tripled recently. So in the last week, 450 people applied for a personal protection order on Michigan Legal Help. So that's just one way of people are getting in and accessing the legal system. But we know that people are really reaching out, and maybe the time has just been too long. Maybe they're feeling like a little more comfort in going out into the world, but people are certainly now reaching out to get help on domestic violence. During this whole pandemic, one thing we've seen is batterers using the pandemic as a tool, either not following safety protocols and putting a survivor and her kids at risk more than, and making her afraid to send the kids for a parenting time if they're separated, or even stay in the home because they're not taking precautions. Or on the other side, we've had abusers who have claimed that the survivors were sick and had COVID and had exposed themselves, and so they weren't sending the kids back for parenting time. So both of those things have been going on during this whole pandemic, in addition to things that always happen around domestic violence. So what can lawyers do? I think this is a really important place for lawyers to step in and can make a difference, particularly now when we're seeing an increased need of people who are just now being comfortable seeking assistance. So we know that abusers create problems in their legal case. First of all, abusers have claimed for years that they have more resources, right? They may be saying, look, I have a job, you don't. I have family who can support me, you don't. And I'm gonna hire a better lawyer. And I'm gonna take custody of our kids and get a better property division. And I'm gonna be sitting pretty and you are gonna be destitute and you're never gonna see your kids. It's very likely a victim has heard this over time. The isolation that has gone on even more now, but always in domestic violence, reduces those options. So that story may be true. It may be true that the survivor doesn't have a job or family to rely on and may not be able to hire a high-paid lawyer. So it's really important that we have lawyers who volunteer to take these cases, who can step in and level that playing field with the batterer who has the resources against the survivor who doesn't, but now they have a lawyer. We know that batterers use the legal system to perpetuate abuse. So they may file motions over and over. They may be frivolous motions, but they at least make everybody panic and go to court. They may not comply with court orders, which was requiring the victim to file a motion for to compel compliance with those orders, and a lot of enforcement actions over and over, which can just be exhausting and scary, because that means in non-COVID times, everybody's going to court and putting the victim at risk. Even now, some cases are being held in person, and so that's a really high level of safety risk and physical safety risk, in addition to the emotional and mental abuse that goes on. So there's also going to court, parenting time exchanges, that puts everybody at risk. And particularly now when maybe an order that was about supervised exchanges can't happen because those people aren't there to supervise. So there's things are even more dangerous for survivors. What we know, lawyers can change things. They can really counterbalance those abusive tactics with good lawyering. These cases, the cases that we do in family law cases and domestic violence, they're really not overly complex legally, but they are really overwhelming to the person who's in that case, to the survivor of domestic violence. So having a lawyer is a game changer. We know that the act of seeking protection in the legal system reduces abuse in a relationship. So just going to seek a PPO, filing for divorce, doing something that is part of the legal system is holding that person accountable. It's a public act, and the public is holding the abuser accountable, and that changes the dynamic. So the legal system is really important in changing the incident of domestic violence. So what can lawyers do? They stop the abuse of the legal process for the first thing, right? They can seek sanctions if an abuser is filing excessive or abusive motions. If a batterer is asking for discovery that is pages and pages long of discovery requests relating to finances when the survivor has nothing, you can get a protective order saying this is just abusive and it's frivolous. Lawyers can avoid mediation, can say mediation doesn't make sense, where power and control make a fair resolution absolutely impossible, or really challenging or terrifying to the survivor. So getting out of the mediation process really can make a difference in some cases. Lawyers can help provide for physical safety. They can get an order for a confidential address so a batterer doesn't know where their survivor is living now. And they can talk about safety planning. Right now we're in COVID, and so a lot of the things that we do on arriving at court, arriving at the front of the court, conducting mediation, dealing with exchanges, all those things are different now in terms of planning, but helping to work through the planning process and what it will look like is really important for lawyers to participate in. And also to advise the client, the survivor, about what happens when we file. Right? Filing for divorce is a dangerous time for survivors of domestic violence. And so advice about that, planning around that, and just talking to make sure the survivor's in a safe place when that happens is really important. Lawyers can also reduce the impact of emotional abuse. Right? We know domestic violence is about power and control. And batterers convince survivors they're worthless, they're bad parents, they're bad children, they're bad siblings, they're stupid. And that isolation means that no other messages are coming through. And a lawyer can be another message. A lawyer can change that message and reaffirm that what someone is doing, the survivor is doing, is right. And that they can be a good parent if they're given the tools to do it and they're given the resources. A lawyer can also ensure financial stability. So for many years, when I first started as a legal aid attorney 20 years ago, we used to talk about just getting safe. Safety is the key. So even if you have to give up money, the long term, you get your kids, you get safe, that's all that matters. But what we found out was that that was a recipe for disaster, that those survivors then had to return to their batterer because they didn't have the resources to support themselves. So now we're smarter, right? Now we're getting orders that provide strong spousal support orders, that provide fair property settlements, right? We can look at fair property settlements. They don't have to be equal. They have to be equitable. And maybe it's true that the damage that's done to a survivor's credit and the problems with their employment history, those have all created a situation where it's fair and equitable to give that survivor more of the property so that she has time to get on her feet, to get back in order to be an economic actor in our community. So those are things, making sure an economic outcome is fair for the survivor is really important. And that's something that lawyers are really important for doing. Lawyers can also help prevent the manipulation of the legal process in the long term, not just during the case. So it's really important for lawyers to get clear, specific, enforceable orders. Here's an example, parenting time, right? Sometimes we get orders that say someone gets reasonable parenting time, and that is a bad thing for survivors of domestic violence. What we need are specifics. And without a lawyer, that doesn't always happen. But lawyers would know to put in the specific time of a parenting time exchange, the location, who can be present. Is the parenting time supervised or not? Are the exchanges in a public place? Are they supervised? Are we doing it at someone else's house? How long does the survivor have to sit there and wait in their car? All those things are things that lawyers are used to thinking through and can give guidance and make sure they're included in orders so that survivors are not left on their own to deal with the aftermath of the case when the case is over. So lawyers make a huge difference for survivors. They really can change the trajectory of that survivor's life by reducing the economic impact, making sure there's safety for the physical side of things, and really a chance for the survivor and their children to be safe in the long term. Lawyers can volunteer. If they want to volunteer for Lakeshore Legal Aid, it's simple. You can go to our website. It's lakeshorelegal.org. There's a tab called Work With Us, and right there you can sign up to be a volunteer. And I hope you'll join us in this fight to help survivors of domestic violence.
Our next speaker is Stephanie Shaw. She is a social worker currently in the city of Dallas, Texas. However, she has worked over 3 years in domestic violence and child abuse fields, including at the YWCA of Metropolitan Detroit. As a community and victim advocate, Stephanie has assisted hundreds of victims in finding housing assistance, personal protection orders, counseling services, safety, and stability in their communities.
I'm Stephanie Shaw. I have been working in domestic violence for the last 3.5, 4 years. I've worked with YWCA, which is Young Women's Christian Association, both in Southern California as well as in Detroit. In Detroit, I was part of a federal grant called Encourage to Arrest, which partnered with YWCA of Metropolitan Detroit and the Domestic Violence Unit with Detroit Police Department. So through that, I was really able to engage in both the shelter side as well as community practice work. So we were out engaging with different communities as well as organizations that both worked closely with domestic violence programming or just wanted to get involved and really unify the city. And then I also did a lot of different court accompaniment work, personal protection, order filing with clients, and just kind of getting them to the different resources that I can provide at my capacity. And then I recently relocated to Dallas, Texas, which has been quite the change, but good as well. And I partner with an organization called Helen's Project. So they not only work with domestic violence victims, but they also have a huge focus on human trafficking, because Texas has some of the highest rates of human trafficking in the nation. And so we do see kind of an overlap in domestic violence and human trafficking. And so that is part of my role, is engaging with the community, educating them, bringing awareness, as well as doing that individual support for clients and families as well. So that's a little bit about me. So this presentation today is really going to just be a overview, safety planning, prevention. What does it look like to best support a victim while they're going through leaving their abuser? Maybe they've just gone through several or one domestic incident, maybe they have children. So I want to cover all those bases just to give a really holistic approach to how social workers and other service providers can best meet the needs of this population. So the first slide I want to go over is the impact of domestic violence. So 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victimized by an intimate partner or have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. In the United States, it's estimated that almost 20 people are victims of domestic violence in some regard every minute, which equates to nearly 10 million persons annually. Along with that, nationally, approximately 50% of murders of females and 25% of men are at the hands of a current or former intimate partner. And along with that, I want to note that When someone is leaving their abuser, oftentimes the first 72 hours is the most dangerous. That's where we see heightened rage in an abuser, and most commonly they're going to be going after the intimate partner or the intimate partner and the children. And so it's really important to keep a victim and survivor safe and far away from that abuser during those first 3 days. It's also been found that over 20,000 phone calls are placed to domestic violence hotlines nationwide on a daily basis. That is a huge amount of calls. I don't even know what the annual number is, but you can imagine 20,000 calls on a daily basis is a lot. And then additionally, it takes an average of 9 times for a victim to leave the abuser relationship permanently. I would say the most common question I get from people who do not work with victims of domestic violence or really don't understand the complex dynamics is, why do these women stay? Why do these men stay? People are so confused because it's often just misinformation and people not understanding, again, how complex this issue is, how, oftentimes victims are staying because they have what I'm going to go into of explaining as these love blinders on. They have these glasses that, for the longest time kept them from understanding that what they were going through with their intimate partner was violence and was wrong. So as we go throughout, I'll kind of use that example multiple times. So I also wanted to note, given the pandemic and everything we're going through this year, a lot is happening within the social services sphere of service provision and programming and things like that. So it's really important to just take a minute and go over the fact that this is not just a local issue. This is not just a national issue. This is a global crisis that we're going through in terms of domestic violence. So I looked at a few different resources and just wanted to kind of paraphrase some of the quotes. So family violence during pandemics is associated with a range of factors, including economic stress, disaster-related instability, increased exposure to exploitive relationships, and reduced options for support. Additionally, with that, we've been in our homes since March, and I think we all thought this would be much shorter than it was, but it's not. And so a big component of domestic violence is social isolation. An abuser will isolate the victim into not only just a home, but also within their relationships. They will become isolated. They won't go out with friends anymore. Their relationships with family will slowly change over time to where the contact with those people is so limited and often controlled by an abuser. So that's really important to take note of. And not only that, even with children, we have all these families that are in homes since March. Some of them not being able to get out is a big deal, especially with kids, multiple kids of different ages. And so thinking about the impact of social isolation and how that can trigger an abuser to become violent, not only to the primary victim, which is their intimate partner, but also the children. So that's something that is another big impact, is that we're seeing heightened reports of domestic violence as well as heightened reports of child abuse. Social connectedness is an increasingly important area of focus during this time as well. Like I mentioned, we're all in our homes. Depending on where we live in the country or in Wayne County, there's an ability to get out, or there's an ability where you kind of feel trapped and you can't get out. So it's important to still stay connected, whether that be FaceTiming family and friends, FaceTiming teachers in school. A lot of the kids are back. That social connectedness is going to really reduce different triggers in the home. It's going to give victims the opportunity to send signals, to kind of alert whoever is on the other line that something's not right. And then lastly on this is a global crisis where increases in homicide, incident reporting, and intimate partner violence and family violence have increased. We know that. It's evident. CPS has reported thousands and thousands of extra calls. Same with domestic violence hotlines. Hopefully this isn't new information, but if it is, we really want to look at this of how can we, as service providers, as people who just generally care about the well-being of not only victims of domestic violence, but also the family unit as a whole. How can we, knowing this information here, serve our clients the best as we can? So I'm going to go into it a little bit more. It's important to know the different types of abuse. So physical abuse is any form of bodily contact that is unwanted or uninvited. Punching, slapping, grabbing the arm, pulling aggressively or violently, shoving someone into the wall. That's going to be our examples of physical abuse. And it's a domination technique where the abuser is trying to assert and show power over the victim. There's verbal abuse where self-esteem is attacked. It's put down, swearing, making demeaning comments and threats, saying, oh, you're fat, you're ugly, no one's going to want you, I'm the only one who wants you, so you have to stay with me. It's really taking any confidence that a victim has and bringing it as low as possible. Emotional abuse is the most difficult to identify. Victims see repeated patterns and feel frustrated, small, or helpless. Broken promises, ignoring a victim, constantly jealous and possessive, withholding affection, attention, feelings. This one is kind of what they say is the one that lasts the longest because it's the most damaging, which is also very frustrating because it's the most difficult to identify. We see a lot of post-traumatic stress. We see even once a victim has left their abuser and continued on dating and is dating new people, there's often a lot of triggers like, oh, are you wearing that? Oh no, should I change? Is this not good enough? There's just this constant back and forth dialogue in a victim's head where they always have to be kind of on the alert and making sure they're doing everything right. That's going to be a side effect of emotional abuse, is never feeling like you're doing things correctly, always questioning what you've done. Economic abuse is going to be our next one, and that is complete or partial control over financial situations and economic resources, forcing victims to beg for money, preventing unemployment, trouble in transportation. This one is arguably one of the largest reasons I've personally found to be very challenging for victims to leave their abuser. And the reason for this is that oftentimes if an abuser controls all the money, the victim might not even have passwords to bank accounts online, might have no money whatsoever. Oftentimes if there's direct deposit, that's getting directly deposited into the bank account that the abuser controls. This can also affect the employment. We've had a lot of victims come through YWCA or even the domestic violence unit where their abuser cost them jobs, cost them, being able to bring more money in or have money on the side that they kept secret from their abuser so that they could leave. So it's definitely a big area of concern. The next one is going to be sexual abuse. So that's anytime sex is unwanted and a person is unwilling to participate, but it is forced on them. About sexual abuse is, we've had women come into the shelters before, both when I was working in Michigan as well as California, where their husband would rape them, and they would have family, friends, whoever they went to for help say, oh, that's not sexual abuse, that's not rape. But it is, because again, this definition says anytime sex is unwanted or the person is unwilling to participate. So there was a lot of, I think, shame associated to this form of abuse for a lot of our clients, because a lot of them felt like, well, that's my husband, so I had to do it. But that is definitely false. So I like to cover that and give an example of that just because it is important. The last one is going to be digital abuse. So that's any abuse related to social media, cyberbullying. This is really big with teens, but I found when I was doing personal protection orders and bringing them to court, I'd always have to add in the other section, social media harassment, blocking the abuser from putting any damaging material or just posting any slander on social media websites that would make the victim look like they were to blame for any reason. That was a big issue. There would be explicit photos posted, They'd be sent to family members, things like that. And that was very demeaning and challenging for our victims that came in too, because it's like, all right, well, nothing's safe because now it's all on the internet. And as we know, the internet, everything leaves a trace. So these are the different types of abuse. And moving forward, we'll kind of see how each one of them is part of power and control and the abuse cycle. So this is the power and control wheel. I'm going to go over this just briefly. I'm just going to go over the different forms, and you can go back in your spare time and just look at the examples. But this is where a abuser is going to use coercion and threats, intimidation, using emotional abuse, using isolation, minimizing, denying or blaming the victim, using children to make them feel guilty, using male privilege, using economic abuse. So some of the things we just mentioned. Different red flags in abusive relationships. An intimate partner may be abusive if he or she acts jealous when you talk to other people, especially the same sex, even friends. So that's what I mentioned. This can lead to isolation, loss of friendships, and familial connectedness. Another red flag is criticizing what you do, what you wear, your interests, your hobbies, pressuring you to do things you don't want to, not listening and ignoring you, controlling you in small ways, holding you too tight, pulling you around, checking your phone, checking even location, because we have the Find My iPhone and other tracking that's available on different forms of technology. Always needing to know what you're doing and who you're with, becoming angry and violent easily, trying to force you into sexual activities, name calling, degrading your gender with jokes and trying to upset you, threats to physical harm and injury or threatening to kill you, threatening to kill pets is another big one, and then emotional or physically harming you and then feels remorseful, might say, oh, I'm so sorry, I'll never do that again. So always kind of backing it up by saying I'm sorry, but then there's that repeated pattern of emotional or physical harm that's then met with remorse after the fact. Why do victims stay? So here's back to that big question I mentioned. A lot of people outside of domestic violence and trafficking just don't understand, why do victims stay? So let's talk about that. There's the economic independence. Like I mentioned, the economic abuse, we're going to find a lot of people have all their records hidden by their abuser. All their money goes directly into an account that is controlled by the abuser. And so that makes it really hard to leave. How can you leave if you have no money, if you've become so isolated that you have no support system? Makes it extremely difficult. When children are involved parenting, there's a lot of guilt from the parenting side of things, because oftentimes if children aren't old enough to really understand unhealthy relationships and abuse, they're going to blame mom or dad for leaving and leaving that intimate partner, because children love both their parents, and it's really hard to explain to them that mommy or daddy being hit or emotionally abused is wrong. So that's definitely a challenge. Religious or cultural pressure in some religions or cultural practices, regardless of how the relationship is, you do not leave. And so it is looked down upon greatly if you do leave. So that pressure alone keeps a lot of victims from being able to leave. Fear, that can be fear of being alone, fear of the abuser coming after the victim, loyalty, denial of love, guilt, security, responsibility, low self-esteem. Again, going back to a victim having been verbally and emotionally abused, we're going to see a lot of them have a low self-esteem. They truly believe that no one will love them except for this person, even though their intimate partner abuses them. Gender role conditioning, lack of decision-making skills, immigration status, pity, and just overall survival. And then here's that cycle of violence that I mentioned earlier as well. So I'm going to give you an example from one of my cases in California. We had a family with just one son, and she was being beaten horribly by her abuser, her boyfriend. And so the tension would build, and then there would be the explosion where mom was beaten by dad, and then there would be this honeymoon. That's where the remorse comes in. That's where the asking for forgiveness and maybe buying gifts comes into play, and then it all starts over again. And it causes this denial where it's really hard for the victim to get out of this. And so we had this one client, and her son was in an individual children's session. And before they had come into the shelter, a social worker was over at the home, and the little boy had this huge stack of video games right by the TV. And so our social worker asked, "Wow, you must love video games. You have so many. What's your favorite?" And he just kind of paused for a minute, and he said, "I don't play those because those are video games I get every time my mom gets beaten, and my dad feels bad, so he buys me another one." And he had not touched any of these video games because even though he was a young boy, he still had picked up on the cycle of abuse between his parents, where every time dad abused mom, he got gifted with something versus her getting gifted. He always received the apology. So I wanted to cover that because that is an example of secondary abuse. That's where children are witnesses to violent crimes like domestic violence. And so it's important to cover that because even though children are children, they pick up on a lot of things we don't realize. And they do pick up on the fact that abuse is wrong and that gifts like that are often, something that doesn't last for a long time. So this is just an example of the cycle of violence and how it typically works. So now I'm going to transition into personal safety plans. So this is really when a victim is ready to leave or preparing to leave. What does that look like to be prepared to go to a shelter, prepared to go to another unknown location from the abuser? What's important to have? Maybe they're ready to get full custody of the children. So they might be coming to the courts to file for custody, things like that. So here's just different aspects of that safety plan that's really important, not only for us to know, but also to educate victims. Let's say a victim has come to us multiple times. Like I mentioned, it takes on average 9 times for a victim to leave their abuser forever, for good. And so let's say this is the 3rd time. With this education, we can be able to tell them what documents, what things are really important while they're preparing to leave. So one thing is calling a shelter program for information. We can do that for them. The victim also has a phone, but again, sometimes it's hard because an abuser is going to track calls, even if they get deleted and things like that. Or maybe they have a mirror on their phone so they get all text alerts and calls. If there's immediate danger, call 911, leave with all children, have a safe contact person or a safety plan with this person. So by that, they mean that let's say the victim has either a family friend, a family member, maybe it's someone from the shelter program. This is their safe contact person. This is the person who's not going to tell anyone else that this person is leaving and that they're ready to find a safe place away from their abuser. And that person should also know the plan, where they're going to be going to get picked up by either law enforcement or that safe contact, the time, all of that. If a restraining order or PPO exists, which is a personal protection order, notify appropriate parties, keep an emergency getaway bag. This one can be really complicated, as if the abuser finds it, it could spark another explosion and act of abuse towards the victim. Here are some really important items to bring with you if a victim is leaving and going to a shelter. IDs for yourself and children. For children, obviously, they're not going to have driver's license for the most part, so just having a school ID or any form of identification, birth certificates, social security cards, those are going to be really important when applying for housing, both transitional as well as permanent housing. School and medical records, legal papers, so the PPO, the TRO, restraining order, marriage license, all of that. If the victim has a car registration is important. passports, green cards, work permits, money, credit, debit cards, extra set of keys for the car, house, office. These documents are really important just because there's so many different ways for a victim to be tracked by their abuser. And so I believe that's going to be later in another slide, but it's important to have all these documents because there's so many ways, unfortunately, now for abusers to become more advanced and track down their families. Personal safety plans continued. Abusers sometimes, if not always, pursue their partner and use specific entities to track them down. Here's what I was talking about. They can use the DPSS office, transfer of any personal or children's records, Department of Motor Vehicles, utility companies, banks, state employment offices, credit reporting agencies, job transfers, any changes to credit or debit cards, voter registration, and then something a lot of people don't think about is any place that the abuser knows you frequent. Grocery stores, employment, doctors, places that have been routinely utilized by the victim. So we all have our grocery store that we always go to. We would tell a victim, pick something else. Oftentimes we'd actually tell a victim to go out of the county somewhere where that abuser just wouldn't think that you would go. Is always really helpful. And I think a lot of us don't think about the tracking, oftentimes with change of address or just change in everything, there's alerts that will go to both you as the victim and the abuser. And so even on documents like the personal protection order, it's important to tell the clerks that you want it to be confidential. Prevention and action. So this is going to be the last part. So access to community resources. There's emergency shelters, transitional housing, legal services, housing services, homeless shelters, employment training and assistance, personal protection order through the police departments and victim advocates, counseling and support groups. I want to highlight counseling and support groups because as victims are leaving their abusers, there are so many emotions. There's remorse and doubt of if they made the right decision or if their abuser is just going to come find them and hurt them anymore. And so there's so many, even just doubts of, am I capable of being independent from this person? I've depended on them for so long, and yes, they beat me, but they take care of me. And so there's all these thoughts going on in the mind of a victim as they're leaving their abuser. And it is a privilege to be able to work with them. And I say that because I don't think we always treat it like a privilege. I think sometimes we just treat it like, oh, well, it's my job. No, it's your job, but it's also a privilege to have a victim trust you and be vulnerable enough to seek counseling, to seek being a part of a support group, because there is so much shame and stigma against victims of domestic violence. Well, why'd you stay? Or why'd you fall in love with someone like that? There's so many questions thrown at them that carry a context of shame and, well, you should have known better, and just guilt in that way. And so when we're working with these clients, it is so important to be empathetic, to have a listening ear, to not, have this whole dialogue in your head of, well, I'll ask them this next and this, like to really sit and hear a victim's story and provide options. That is something that a lot of people don't recognize as impactful for these victims and their families. And then they're going through things with their children if their children are with them. Their children might be throwing tantrums or showing, similar behaviors to an abuser. And so they're not only going through their own connectedness to this abuser, but now they're trying to work with their children and they're trying to work with all these agencies in the community, and it's very overwhelming. So again, that's why I call it a privilege, because a lot of victims don't want to share their story. They don't want to feel pity. They don't want to feel shame or guilt or any of these things. So that's why it's so important for organizations within the community to really be a support system for these men, women, and children, because this is a very heavy part of social justice and change, which leads me to the last part, which is education and awareness. That's kind of my sweet spot within the field. I love going out to agencies and educating them on what domestic violence is, what it's not, how can we be a part of the change, how can we uplift the voice of these victims of crime in a way that allows them to kind of take the mic, share their story, share how they were able to leave their abuser permanently and move forward with their life. And that also means that we're bringing awareness to the issue. We are removing the stigma and really allowing a new space for conversation, and especially even with younger generations, teaching them what is healthy, what's unhealthy, how should you communicate, and just teaching them as well. Same thing with, maybe some different wording, but we need to be engaged with not only adults but kids as well, especially as they're going through middle school and high school and engaging with all the social media and everything going around in their community. So that is the end of my presentation. That's the references. And that is it. Thank you so much for watching and listening.
Our third speaker is Judge Melissa Ann Cox. She was elected to the 3rd Judicial Circuit Court in November 2016 and is assigned to the Family Division. Throughout her career, she served as Assistant City Attorney for several municipalities, and in that capacity, prosecuted criminal misdemeanors and civil infractions and defended civil litigation lawsuits.
My name is Judge Melissa Cox. I am a family court judge in the 3rd Circuit, which is Wayne County, Detroit, Michigan. I was elected to that seat in 2016, and since that time, I've served as a judge in the family court. Prior to being a judge, I worked as a attorney as well as a prosecuting attorney. And I prosecuted countless domestic violence cases. I've also represented individuals as a defense attorney who have been accused of domestic violence. So I've seen the issues at this point in my career intimately from all sides. So currently, I'm involved with domestic violence cases on a regular basis, a daily basis, really. When I became a judge in the family court, I underwent a rigorous and very emotionally grueling training program. It's a national training program for judges handling cases involving domestic violence. When I returned from that training, I was immediately assumed one of the roles on our specialty domestic violence court, where I was assigned custody and divorce cases involving some of the worst domestic violence offenses. Those cases are particularly fragile, as they often occur when a victim has decided to leave a relationship. Which is one of the most dangerous times for a victim really in their entire life. So deciding custody and parenting time in these situations is tremendously difficult, it's tremendously delicate, and we make sure that any judges who are experiencing these cases have continuing training and a good background of training. So that's how I became involved handling these types of cases. So what I would say relative to attorneys being able to help their clients or help families really who are experiencing some type of family violence is for them to have some sort of special training. Anybody who is involved working in family law of any sort should be trained as it relates to domestic violence. It is a cycle. It is a legacy within families. It continues on unless the cycle is broken. In order to help, you need to know what it is that you're looking for. The first step in stopping domestic violence is identifying it. People don't recognize how difficult it is. If you have a client that you don't know is experiencing domestic violence, certainly you can't help that family. There are a lot of things that prohibit attorneys and judges really from recognizing that domestic violence is involved in a situation. Victims and offenders, they tend to rationalize, deny, minimize their behavior. For a victim, it's generally a learned coping mechanism. So when you have a client denying or rationalizing the behavior that is violence, you have to know how to recognize that before you can help that person address it. So training, education, more training, more education, continued to know what to do to help a client as an attorney and also as a judge. And then I would say to have information available for your client, for a victim of domestic violence, is absolutely imperative. No one ever knows what is going to be the day that that person is going to seek help. So while you may not convince the person who's in front of you to obtain help that day, tomorrow might be the day that they need that help. And if you haven't given them the information, the resources, the community programs that are available to them, the contacts that they need, then they will again be helpless. So it's not always about getting them to do what you think they should do in the moment. It's about giving them enough information, enough arsenal, so that when they are ready to make that decision for themselves, they know where to go. So COVID certainly has impacted the domestic violence cases within our community and the people that I serve in the family law bench of Wayne County. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody to hear the statistics that domestic violence cases are at an all-time high. Child abuse cases, intimate partner violence is certainly exacerbated during this time that families are in their homes together on a long-term perpetual basis. So we have seen a huge increase in those types of cases regarding abuse of children, abuse of spouses, violence within the family. We early on during the pandemic, to make that matters worse, had to close the court. So access to some of the most important mechanisms to help keep people safe was limited or non-existent. So quickly, several of the judges together on the family bench came together and implemented literally overnight an online system to develop personal protection orders that people can obtain from their home, from the police department, really anywhere that they have access to the internet or where somebody has access to internet that can help them. We've done, I think, a very good job of pushing that information to the community through news outlets. I know there were a couple of news articles that perpetuated the information relative to how to obtain a PPO during the COVID crisis. So that was our initial response to what was an exacerbated problem with less resources to help. So domestic violence impacts the community that I serve in Wayne County, and particularly the family court, in a number of ways. It's a pervasive issue in almost all of the types of cases that I deal with, from custody, divorce, parenting time, child support. But most importantly, we have a very highly specialized personal protection order court in the Third Circuit Court, where we offer the service of obtaining personal protection orders to the entire community. That court was started many years ago and has since taken on really a life of its own. It's an individual court, an individual docket within our courthouse, and the judges, again, who work that docket are specially trained to handle those types of cases. Okay, so in closing, what I wanted to indicate is that the impact that family violence has on children is astounding. And until I became a judge, when I experienced domestic violence, family violence cases between adults, I didn't understand this. Before I had the requisite training, I didn't understand that it was such a big part of the cycle and the process. But children who witness verbal, physical abuse or see the repercussions of it on a regular basis suffer trauma that is really irreparable. They have feelings of fear, anger, isolation, low self-esteem. They can't trust people. These are just a few of the things that they experience at the time and certainly later in life. Learning disabilities and behavioral problems resurface. They're exacerbated in family units where women are abused by a partner. There's also a high incidence of child abuse by the perpetrator. Statistically, incest is more common in those homes as well. So I think that statistics are really important if you're working in the area of domestic violence. There's some of the things that really help me to keep perspective and keep me motivated when I'm in the trenches and when it's difficult to recognize or understand or figure out how to help in a situation that I'm tasked with. To know that this problem is huge. It is, again, a family legacy that carries on. Children who witness and are victims of domestic violence often put themselves in those same situations, either as victim or perpetrator. So helping these families while they're experiencing it is of utmost importance to changing the incidence of domestic violence throughout our community and into the future. And I think lastly, the most important thing to remember is that the judicial system is tasked with helping all people in a family. We can't help the family unless we help the victims, we help the children, and we also help the perpetrator. So identifying community resources that can help the perpetrator of violence understand and hopefully change their behavior is also vital to breaking the cycle.
Our next speaker is the Honorable Patrick Shannon, who has served as the Chief Judge for the Sagawau-Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan since 1999. Chief Judge Patrick Shannon served as an elected prosecuting attorney for Chippewa County, a tribal prosecutor, and served as a Special Assistant United States Attorney.
Sure. I'm Patrick Shannon. I'm currently the Chief Judge of the Saginaw-Chippewa Tribe of Mount Pleasant, Michigan. I reside in Sault Ste. Marie and then also work here in Mount Pleasant. I have an apartment here, but my background is I'm a graduate of the University of Detroit Law School, and also undergrad Central Michigan. I served as a county prosecutor for, first was elected in 1980, then for 5 terms. But during that time, I was a prosecutor for Bay Mills Indian community and a couple of other tribes. And so during that period of time, I was working not only in state courts, but in the tribal courts. But then I was appointed as SAUSA, Special Assistant U.S. Attorney, back long before there were tribal prosecutors, federal prosecutors assigned to Indian country. I was appointed one in the Western District. And it was for this reason. It was really domestic violence or crimes of violence in Indian country, and many of which were domestic in relation in reality. And so even when I was a county prosecutor, I was involved in training in domestic violence areas and prosecuting. And I was while I was a prosecutor, I was also then elected president of the Prosecutors Association, and was involved in a number of trainings in the area of domestic violence. And we had a shelter in the Sioux and in Chippewa County, and was active in meeting with them and prosecuting those type of cases. And throughout the career, I worked in Indian country though throughout my career, really. So, and then I've served either full-time or part-time in the capacity of the tribal judge here for 21 years as of last week. I do have a background in public health. I have a master's in public health from the University of Michigan, and I got that while I was a prosecutor. I would commute down, if you can imagine that. I can't imagine I had that much energy, but I was looking at intentional violence as a public health problem. And it was a little early because I graduated in '92. And at that time, the Center for Disease in Atlanta, Georgia, hadn't created any center on intentional violence. And so it was a little, even at U of M, I was kind of out on a ledge and studying that. But I've been able to look at a lot of the things that occur as a public health problem and utilizing those kind of tools. And so it's fascinating. And I've been able to do that more recently with our drug court and also the effects on kids, and things called like weathering and allostatic load, and trying to look at causation and prevention. So, but that's kind of my background. So it is, and then also I took a kind of a sojourn away from the courts, and I was a director of charter schools for Bay Mills Community College, and we were able to charter schools off the reservation in the Upper Peninsula in pretty needy areas. And we applied those type of public health attitudes in dealing with our kids, because some of the kids who are coming from homes there could be a lot of violence or whatever going on. Then they would go to school and have to take the NEEP test or whatever test they were giving at the time, and being held to the same standard as kids from a little more affluent communities. So, and then I came back into the courtroom a few years ago, so because I missed it. But that's kind of what I am. I look at things a little bit differently than probably most former prosecutors or judges, applying a public health approach, and that applies to domestic violence. I run this drug court, and it's quite successful. We've engaged medication-assisted treatment, and then with COVID, it's been really difficult getting people back. But running through all of that is this concept of violence in the homes and with kids, and a lot of it's pretty silent now. So, and our lead victims person just resigned and took a job in Corvallis, Oregon. So right now, as I speak, and their last day was yesterday. So right now, but that's extremely important in witness preparation, especially, and for trials, not only in the tribal court, but in the federal district court. That's been extremely important for crimes of violence against women and others and children. And so that's been very active. I should have mentioned that when I was prosecutor, we created one of the first victim witness programs in the state, and in order to get people ready for court to testify. In Sault Ste. Marie and Chippewa County was kind of you think, well, it's up in the UP, but we were pretty busy around an international border. And when I was prosecutor, there were 5 prisons in the county with 5,000 inmates. So the episodes of violence seemed to be higher than most rural counties. But the tribe has been active, very active in witness and victims' rights, and especially in the area of domestic violence. Part of the challenge, though, is to get the people to come forward too, and any small community that's always a challenge, and to get them comfortable with working with the police. And I know the police here have some good resources as well. Certain officers trained in that area. We opened up first week of June. We've been operating face-to-face since June, first part of June. And we've relied upon a lot of really good public health recommendations. And so we felt early on it was important to get the clients who come to the court face-to-face with me, and rather than Zoom. Now, we can do Zoom, but I just don't feel it's as effective. But yeah, I right now with dealing some of our clients, most of whom, when we came back, and many of these are women who have experienced some level of violence and experience some kind of a PTSD as well. But what we noticed is that a few just kind of dropped off, but they're very happy to get back face to face back in June. But I don't know the extent. I'm dealing with a finite number of people who come to court, and the extent out there in the community beyond the court, what effect is it having? I know I have to speak next week to a group, and it's about the COVID and substance misuse courts, and and I've felt in places like British Columbia, they're experiencing, you know, increases in overdose. And then so you have to, when you start seeing that, you have to kind of think about, okay, why are they using? Why are they overdosing? Is it trauma? Are they dealing with some past trauma and PTSD? Which I think in my heart, you know, if anyone who's been in the courtroom any amount of time, you can see it, okay? And you can see it in your clients, generally women. And so we've been able to intervene now again with our clients, but I'm just wondering how significant it is out there, because things are a little crazy. And if you haven't noticed, but there seems to be a little nutso out there. So when people are looking for alternatives to reality, and you know, we're part of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, and so we discuss these type of things, what's going on around the country on a monthly basis. And the influx of, it's not just fentanyl, it's methamphetamine now, but fentanyl's in everything, and it just kills. And so we're really astute on that, in that we get the testing that's necessary. And so I don't know if we know right now the extent of family violence or any of that that's going on, but people are getting, I noticed over the summer, they're getting very edgy now. It's just, and so how is that playing out? And I don't think we're going to know for a while, unfortunately. But there seems to be an intersection of COVID and substance misuse, and places like British Columbia and other places are seeing an increase in overdose. And I know I'm kind of trailing off into another area, but it's all related to me. It's, you know, violence and substance misuse and the public health. So I don't know if that answers any questions, but it creates more questions in my head. It's what's going on, and I don't think we have our hands around this thing yet. So the last 2 years we've done a opioid summit, and this year we couldn't do it, but we're expanding it to include opioid misuse and substance misuse and infectious diseases. And we're in the midst. We did for example, we did something recently with the University of Detroit Law School. We did an expungement clinic, because we had a number of people who have state charges, and so we did this clinic, and we were able to at least find one woman who we expunged. We were able to get her record expunged in state court. So we're trying to do some more mini sessions, online virtual summits, and our first one at a meeting today that I missed, but it's infectious diseases, which included Hep A, Hep C, Hep B, HIV, and now COVID. How do we, as practitioners in the court, we should know more about this and then train our clients. That will be opened up to all the tribes, and probably in the Midwest and probably across the country. But you know, people engaging in types of behavior, whether it's violence or substance misuse, are subject to a higher incidence of these infectious diseases. So we're trying to get out that kind of information out to other tribes. Also, what we're doing in our Healing to Wellness family program, we recognized after doing the adult programs and even the juvenile programs, we weren't getting in early enough. And so with our family program, we're intervening earlier, trying to cut off that violence toward children and in the home, so that they don't blow up when they're 13, 14, 15 years old, which we see. I think every court in the state sees that. And so we're trying to intervene earlier, and it's difficult. So we're into prevention here, but there are a couple articles. I wrote a bar article in August 2019, and then School of Public Health ran an article about our program in about April, I think, in the School of Public Health. It's kind of an alumni magazine, and which kind of outlines what we do, which deals with not just substance misuse, but it's also behavioral health and a number of other things, trying to get in and prepare prepare people to be preventive in the areas of public health and also, and I include in that violence, okay, because that's just the way I feel. I think it is a public health problem, intentional violence. So we have a number of things, and plus we're always available to talk to. I think we learn the most from sharing. You know, one thing that's different about tribal court is that we have different resources, certainly, and one of them is that we engage weekly is spirituality, and you can't do that in the state or federal courts. You can't pray, okay, and some people are very comfortable with that. So, so we engage all those resources to make people healthier and safe, You know, the focus is to make sure the kids are safe and the women are safe, because generally it's a mom raising the kids. So many times it's discouraging, but there are numerous bright spots along the way. So the best of luck to everyone out there.
And our last speaker is Roy Kranz, a prosecutor with the United States Attorney's Office in the Bay City Branch Office. Roy's primary focus is prosecuting defendants who physically and sexually abuse women and children in Indian country. In these types of cases, Roy has gotten defendants sentenced to 30, 65, and 72 years, as well as life sentence.
Hi, I'm Roy Kranz. I'm an assistant United States attorney. I started as a state prosecutor in Isabella County for 11 years. And then when I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office, that was in 2009. So I've been here about 11 years as well. So as a state court prosecutor, especially in a small office, you handle a little bit of everything. And of course, that involves some domestic violence cases. I actually tried a murder case that was a domestic violence case. And then when I was hired with the U.S. Attorney's Office, I was hired to handle the Indian country cases from the Saginaw Chippewa tribe, which happens to be in Mount Pleasant, where I was a state court prosecutor. And the majority of those cases, unfortunately, involve domestic violence, strangulation, sexual assault, and things like that. When I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office, all of the training happens in South Carolina at the University of South Carolina. It's the National Advocacy Center. And as I mentioned at the time, I had been a state prosecutor just before this and handled a lot of the different cases, but I had realized that domestic violence cases were unique. Oftentimes, the victims will recant and claim that whatever happened to them did not happen. They will minimize, sometimes flat out lie to protect their abuser. And so, and often these crimes of domestic violence are committed in private, so there's no eyewitnesses. The experts will tell you that you can observe 100 people that have been actually strangled, and you're only going to notice marks on the neck of about 15 of those 100. So there's a lot of things that make those cases challenging. And when I went to the NAC, I was in a big room full of people that do Indian country cases, and one of the women stood up and introduced herself, and she says, "All I do is sexual assault and domestic violence in Indian country, and I love my job." And I thought, that woman's crazy. Those are hard cases. But now that's kind of what I'm doing, and I feel the same way she does. I have a passion for handling these cases and trying to help victims of domestic violence. So with COVID, I suspect that there's a lot of domestic violence happening that isn't being reported. Especially with the lockdowns where you're not supposed to leave your house. It puts these victims in a position where they really, not only psychologically, but physically can't get away from their abusers. So I suspect that there's a lot of unreported acts of domestic violence that are happening. As far as my practice goes, I, unlike a lot of assistant U.S. attorneys, will call victims regularly at grand jury as part of my practice, and there's several reasons for that. One is, I think it's the earlier you can have somebody testify about something like this, the less likely it is that they're going to not tell you the truth. And also, I think it's much easier for them to tell the truth when the abuser is not in the courtroom, which they're not for grand jury. With domestic violence, there is a ton of witness tampering that occurs from the suspect to the victim. And the sooner you can get the victim under oath saying what happened, I think that helps alleviate some of that witness tampering. If the suspect knows that the victim's already under oath said what happened, there's not as much incentive for them to try and get the victim to change their story at that point. So I think with COVID, I'm guessing that the witness tampering is, more intense. It's probably last a lot longer and is going to be more effective because, the more they work on that person, and unfortunately people in the community, it's a small community, the reservation, there's only a couple thousand members, and there's certainly pressure from other community members not to work with the police. Also, domestic violence abusers are often very charming and very different in front of other people than they are in front of the person that they're abusing. So often the community will support the abuser thinking this guy would never do something like this. I don't believe this woman. And she's changed her story a couple other times when she claimed this happened, which is very common. So there'll be pressure, unfortunately, from her friends and family and that kind of thing to not cooperate, where, they think she's lying, and so they're telling her not to get this guy in trouble when they don't think he did it, even though he did. So that may be a little bit long-winded for what you were looking for, but that's I think some of the effects that COVID's had on the practice of domestic violence. And so as long as one of the people, the defendant or the victim, are considered Indian for federal court purposes, and it happened on the reservation, then we could have jurisdiction over that. So about half of my cases are against non-Indian defendants that victimize Indian victims. But there's also a fair number of Indian defendants, so they have the resources, they have the per capita, but their victim is non-Indian, so they're not getting any money from the tribe, so they could be in that pool of people that would need assistance. I will say that as far as the assistance needed from attorneys, victims do get a lot of, I think, help from our office. Obviously, we handle the criminal case, trying to hold the abuser accountable in federal court. We also have a victim specialist that works directly in our office. There's also a victim advocate, or sometimes two, often two of them, that work for the tribe that assist. So these advocates can not only, try and emotionally support the victim, but they also hook them up with the services that they need if they're in need of bus passes or food assistance or a hotel to stay in because they need to get away from the abuser and have a safe place to stay. There's a lot of different services that they can hook them up with, counseling and things like that. As far as attorneys providing pro bono services, I imagine that there's a lot of victims that would really like to talk to a private attorney about, what they would have to do to divorce the abuser, what process they would have to take, and that kind of thing. And also, I would think child custody would be another big issue that we couldn't assist in. So I think a lot of the pressure on the victim to stay with the abuser is financial dependence, and also worries that the children that they share will be taken away from them by the abuser. Our advocates can help the person get a personal protection order. There's often bond conditions that prevent, contact and things like that. But as far as, he says he's going to take the kids away if I tell the truth, we can explain that, they're required to tell the truth when they're subpoenaed, and I'll even ask questions of the victim, even at grand jury when the defendant's not there. Are you here because you want to be here today? And if they say no, I say, you're only here because you know you could get in trouble if you don't show up, right? Yeah. And so I kind of give them a little bit of cover. So if the defendant ever does see the transcript from the grand jury, he's going to say, oh, well, she didn't want to be there. They forced her to do that. And so, I mean, I even talked to him ahead of time about that. Do you want me to go through these questions to kind of give you some cover? And often they do. But as far as like, I want to divorce my husband, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to file for custody of the children. That's definitely outside our area that we can help them. And I'm sure there are other things that I'm not thinking of, but those are the two main ones that come to mind where, not only do they need that for their own personal reasons, but it also could affect whether or not they're willing to tell the truth in our case. So it kind of intertwines, but it's not an area that we can directly help them with. In the past, I have noticed that because it's so common for victims of domestic violence to not fully cooperate with us like you'd expect a victim to do. I mean, I've seen the whole gamut. I've had trials where the victim has come up to me afterwards after the guy's been convicted and said, you just saved my life and my children's lives. But on the flip side, probably more commonly, I've had the victim say to me, you're ruining my life by prosecuting the person that abused them when they claim they don't want that to happen. So I have noticed over the years that police and prosecutors both can kind of become tainted by that. So if the police are aware of the fact that a victim has recanted more than once, and they are sent to the house for a new assault that has occurred on the victim, unfortunately, there are officers that have been tainted over the years that may not put the full effort forward on investigating a case, and because they just think it's a waste of their time. They figure that the victim is likely to recant again, and so anything that they put forth is just, never going to come to fruition. They're going to, whatever they do, it's going to be the same outcome anyway. So I think in state court, they have a couple tools that we don't have that are very helpful. One is the prosecutor is able to use what the victim said to the police about what happened as substantive, now I can't say it, as substantive evidence of what happened during the incident. So it's normally that would be hearsay and not admissible, but in state court you can use that. Also, the prosecutor can use any act of domestic violence, I believe, that was committed by the defendant against anyone within 10 years to show something that normally you can't show, that he's more likely to commit domestic violence because of his past. We don't have these tools in federal court, but what I do have is most of my cases are investigated by the tribal police, and they have body cameras that are recording what everyone says. And often they get there so quickly that the victim is still upset and crying. And there's an exception to hearsay called excited utterance. So if you can show that somebody's still under the stress of the excitement of what happened to them, then what they said about it, in theory, they're not going to think to lie about what happened because they're still so emotionally upset about it. So I've had trials in federal court where the victim gets on the stand and literally says, I don't remember anything. I was too drunk. And I play the video of what they said happened. We get it admitted. And the judge, has ruled in favor of those videos coming in, not only under excited utterance, but in that particular case, there's a catch-all hearsay exception. So if you can show that the information is reliable, even if it doesn't fit within one of the standard exceptions to hearsay, you can also admit it that way. And in this case, we had questioned the victim about her love for the defendant, and she said she loved him. And I said, well, you probably would never lie and say something bad that he did that wasn't true to get him in trouble because you love him, right? Yeah, so if you said anything bad, it must be true, right? Because you'd never make that up to get this guy in trouble. And she would agree. So we've convicted people and sent them to federal prison for years when the victim's entire trial testimony is, I don't remember anything, I was drunk, you know, because she's trying to cover for him. So if you have, you know, those kind of tools, you really should investigate every single case as if you're not going to need the victim at trial. I mean, sometimes there's not going to be enough, even then. I mean, even if you put the effort forth. But if you talk to, you know, a lot of these people live in small neighborhoods and, you know, maybe trailer parks or whatever, where there could be neighbors that have heard things or seen things. Even children could be good witnesses, even though it's tough to put a child through that. It might be worth, you know, the discomfort that it causes to, you know, help these people get away from the abuser and not have this be something that goes on, because children that witness this, unfortunately, often become victims and perpetrators of domestic violence. They think this is normal. So it's kind of a cycle that sometimes you know, if you can help break that cycle, then you're doing more than just the victim a favor, I think.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Maureen Flav, and I'm the Deputy Court Administrator for the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. Thank you for watching the video, and I hope that it was informative and enlightening, and that it encourages you to seek out ways to help victims of domestic violence by providing pro bono services. I would like to again thank Ashley Lowe, Stephanie Shaw, Judge Melissa Ann Cox, Judge Patrick Shannon, and Roy Kranz for their participation in this video. I would also like to thank Kelly Clark, Training Coordinator for the United States District Court, and Crystal Flood, Administrative Assistant. Thank you again for watching, and have a great day.